Okay, hello everyone. Good to be back. If you are all ready and set to go, we are going to discuss an article today. At least that's my plan. I wanted to share an article that I recently read, although it's not a new article, but I found it quite nice because it was written in 2013, way before all these troubles about Hizmet movement start. But the way the writer tries to put Hizmet movement into a perspective in terms of politics, and especially in terms of international politics, it is quite refreshing to see without having judgments or biases about the movement of 15th July coup attempt. So I wanted to show you what is that. Here is the article you can see. We're going to read Sabine Dreher's article. It's published in Sociology of Islam in 2013. And it is going to talk about the proper article is what is the Hizmet movement, contending approaches to the analysis of religious activists in the world politics. So in here you can see it puts Hizmet movement into category of religious activists and their influence in the world politics. But if you look into the abstract, the article actually clearly tries to understand the role of religious activists in world politics from international relations perspective, which is something I tend to talk about it, especially this keyword, transnationalism. So you don't need to have the article in front of you, but you can always go to academia website and find Sabine Dreher's page and download it from there. It's free, you can access it. So the paper proposed a critical theory of religion and encourages researchers to accept individual religiosity, class and identity in the study of religious actors. The paper develops three avenues of inquiry. First, a better typology of religious actors in world politics is needed to classify them in their political and social context. This is practically the difficulty that the writer had while she was trying to classify Hizmet movement. Second, citing the example of Turkish Hizmet movement of Fethullah Gülen, the central role played by the economic engagement is analyzed from a neo-Gramscian perspective in international political economy. In so doing, Hizmet is represented as a non-Western expression of neoliberal globalization. All this in mind, as part of the globalizing elite. Lastly, the Hizmet's international activities are presented as potentially having unforeseen consequences in the light of its creation and reproduction as a transnational social space. So this unforeseen consequences after the July coup attempt might be much more interesting, but I want to take you to the conclusion of the article, just making sure everything is okay, because I haven't seen anyone commenting anything, so I'm not sure whether the stream is okay so far. But I want to take you to the end of the article and show you what the final outcome that she thinks about this, and then we'll go through some of the points she makes, and for the people who knows about Hizmet movement, it's going to be interesting to see how it can be defined or it can be viewed or observed from outside. From people who don't know much about Hizmet movement, it's a good place to start, I would say. Although the writer had other articles as well. Sorry, my phone is trying to communicate with me whilst I am doing this. Shows how everyone is listening us. Okay, so I'll read the introduction and the conclusion and then skim through the in between. So I have read the article before, and you can read it. But as I said, I'll just highlight the points that I really enjoyed, reading. The Hizmet service refers to a faith-based civil society movement from Turkey, whose adherents have developed an unprecedented global network of thousands of individuals and institutions that span various spheres of this is what happens, isn't it? Various spheres of human organization, founded in Turkey and framed in terms of Islam. Hizmet collectively contends that math and science-based education, economic development, and intercultural dialogue are primary ingredients necessary to combat the humanity's threefold enemies: ignorance, poverty, and disunity. So then it talks about the developmental stage of the Hizmet movement are well known. For instance, Agai, Hendrik, Truman. These are all well-known writers in this area. An initial community emerged in the late 1960s and consolidated itself in 1970s in accordance with the teachings of Turkish religious functionary named Fethullah Gülen. At the time, many who were inspired by Gülen spread his message through video and audio cassette. So it talks about the importance of this, and then other ventures like publishing house and bookstore. The 1980s, there was a period of consolidation, rise of private investment, especially after Özal came into power. Well, mainly Joshua Hendricks thinks that after 1980s, Hizmet become a bit more emerged. Let's say after the Cold War, the movement internationalized with the establishment of schools and universities in the neighboring countries, including Central Asia and Balkans. Upon Turkey's Justice and Development Party came into power in 2002, Hizmet expanded globally. Well, Hizmet expanded before AK Party, but yes, well, maybe. Although initially allied with the party, this allegiance is now being reconsidered. Mind you, this is 2013. Notwithstanding, Hizmet's activities now include approximately 1,000 schools and several universities in approximately 130 countries, as well as business ventures and dialogue centers throughout the world. So it talks about, makes a small, let's say, the summary of it. I want to quickly take you to the final part, and then I want to go through some other parts. Okay, the conclusion. Here's the conclusion. I didn't highlight this part because I thought we can read it together. Hizmet cannot be classified easily in political terms. Yeah, so this is the difficulty the writer had here. An adherent, for instance, someone who is part of Hizmet movement, will focus on the movement's fight against poverty, ignorance, and disunity through work, the mobilization of capital, and dialogue, and in doing so, will emphasize its globally oriented humanism. Okay, so that is how a movement person would define Hizmet movement, or would have defined Hizmet movement. It might be changed now. A Marxist will look at the business side and the movement's support for neoliberalism and label it as form of a new right, as an expression of globalizing elite intent to extending global free markets with slight modification. So Marxists would look at the Hizmet movement, and they would think, according to the writer, they would think that, well, this is clearly a form of neoliberalism with slight modifications or slight changes of some religious motivation behind it, but it is effectively part of neoliberal or even a capitalist thing. A feminist will see Hizmet movement. A feminist will see Hizmet movement and its support for traditional family values and role that allocated to the women, and dismiss the detrimental to women interests. So the feminists apparently, or according to the writer, would find that Hizmet movement is actually reinforcing the traditional family values, but this doesn't. I know it may sound something positive for many people, but traditional family values also include that woman has to stay at home and look after the kids and shouldn't take part in the social life and stuff, which in theory is not the exact position of the Hizmet movement, but in practice you can see that women are not equal, they don't have equal footage within the Hizmet activities anyway, so yes, rightly so, a feminist would see Hizmet movement as another patriarchal tool, and like trying to put women in a traditional point, and so they would dismiss the Hizmet. The jihadi Salafist will bulk at its notions of tolerance and dialogue, weaving it its way too liberal. So the radicals or jihadi Salafis wouldn't like the Hizmet movement because of the ideas of tolerance and dialogue, and they would find it very liberal. That's a very easy way to put it down. By contrast, as an assertive secularist, this is interesting, as an assertive secularist, this is not a normal secular, but this is a bit Kemalist secularist, will charge it with the intentions to overthrow the secular social order. So assertive secularists, and the article also discusses the possibility that neocons in America especially would find Hizmet movement or similar religious groups and organizations, or they will perceive it as a threat. And that is very similar to Kemalists in Turkey, let's say. And the very idea is that there is a distrust about whether the religious organizations can do any good, especially Islam, which is not, in their mind, is not compatible with the modern world. Which article the writer actually discusses about this issue widely. If I can, I will look into that a little. But so this is the one of the things I think it is occurring. The recent Economist article was emphasizing on this part a lot, that it is a dangerous movement or it's a dangerous actor. Not necessarily there is anything that has been done in order to prove that point, but basically that assertive secularism, that neoconservative identity actually makes them feel a bit afraid from the religious organizations like the Gulen movement or Hizmet movement. That's because they think that they are trying to overthrow the secular or social order. So what has become clear is that more systematic study of Gulen's thinking and application in practice is needed. Of course, especially not only in thinking and in application is needed as well. I was probably about to fold my PhD thesis by the time this article has written, like for 7 years ago. The original intention of this author was to find whether Hizmet was a bulwark against neoliberalism. So the preliminary answer is no. Hizmet reinforces both state and market. It has become a major force in Turkey's economic integration and has indeed become an active player in the world market. Whether Hizmet economics assist peripheral economies with their development, as the Bosnia case seems to indicate, requires more investigation. Ultimately, further research through the notion of transnational social space may provide some detailed insight into the changing identity that comes with these spaces. Such an approach will allow us to see both unifying elements provided by Gulen's theology and differentiating elements that come into play when the global meets the local in diverse world contexts. There's a nice long list of references after that. So the article claims that it is difficult to locate Hizmet movement politically, but although it does a very good job of at least trying to picture that. So I'll try to find the relevant sections and quickly go through them. I'll just skip the methodological consideration. So, classification of the Hizmet religion. So, when it comes to classification of Hizmet, I don't know why. International relations needs a classification system of religious actors and their relationship to politics that takes religiosity seriously. Citing the Hizmet movement of Fethullah Gulen as a case, I introduce how the inner and the outer layers of the movement work together to realize a collective project. It's interesting that the writer actually refers it as inner and outer. Most people would think there is a, within Hizmet movement at least, the grassroots activists would think it's a homogeneous organization, but it is not actually. There is an inner and outer layers of the movement in a way. I then discuss the relation between religion and the politics in general and conclude that Hizmet is best understood as a conservative but outward-oriented Islamic sect that has political and economic interests, but that does not seek to create an Islamic state. So the writer thinks that, for instance, Hizmet used to think at least that Hizmet is should be understood as a conservative movement, but it is also outward-oriented Islamic movement and Islamic sect. I don't know why they put it down as a sect, because it's a totally different area that has political and economic interests, but does not seek to create an Islamic state. That's interesting. So it's not in a way trying to do, let's say, Sharia. So from a religious studies perspective, the movement can be classified as a form of sect because it offers a specific interpretation of a larger religious tradition. Then Ihsan Yilmaz in here reads it as a type of sect that led by a leader providing guidance in times of crisis, especially renewal by Tajdid. In article, Ihsan Yilmaz talks a lot about that. Some people think that it is a revival of Naqshbandi Sufism in form of a neo-Sufi theology that follows the footsteps of Sayyid Nursi. It's partly true, but I can't agree totally, because it's totally not a revival of a Naqshbandi Sufism especially. Anyway, Gulen combined Sufism with a very traditionalist interpretation of the Sharia. Or Agai concludes, Beki Makai says, Gulen is a part of the Islamic mainstream, although his worldview is very traditional. Agai and others point out, however, the movement convinced the conservative circles to send their daughters to school or university while upholding their traditional views on the role of women. And then, well, it also talks about, for instance, how Gulen can be very traditionalist, especially when it comes to, for instance, an article it refers to the death punishment of an apostate. I think there is a further clarification needs on that. That's a very fair point in there. Although Gulen almost regurgitates the ruling about that and how people perceived something, it looks like it is very, very problematic. And he also, like the article also puts some emphasis on how Gulen, like for instance, the tone of Gulen, some of his work often leads to one to conclude that his project is about Islamification, which indeed seems, the movement is about Islamic imperialism to spread Islam. Otherwise, how else we could interpret Gulen's notion that the whole humanity would be better served if it were under the umbrella of Islam? Of course, it's very romantic to think that way, but it's also understandable in a way that Gulen is a Muslim scholar and he thinks that if everything would be perfect, an Islamic umbrella would be the best place for everyone else to live in and stuff. So, for instance, a guy says Gulen's teaching, specifically his emphasis on nationalism, have given way to a more global approach. The above quotations may no longer be represented. So the article also considers that it might have changed. Some of this stuff might have changed. In terms of organization, Hizmet's organizational composition is instructive. Two researchers have concluded that it's necessary to distinguish at least two layers: an inner core constituted by the sect members and a broader periphery made up of firms and non-profit organizations. You can even define it in a different ways, but yeah, that is pretty much like sohbet groups and others. So these are, important. And it also talks like how it can actually reflect different stuff in different places. For instance, the conclusion of documentary, there was a documentary that Hizmet was creating parallel society in Germany, an impression in part created by the movement's inclination of strategically ambiguous organizational practices defined by Joshua Hendrick. But it also, later on, it will explain some other stuff as well. So having understood that there is an inner core that is best understood as a sect, whose theological teaching needs rigorous study, and an outer layer composed of different organizations and institutions that are predominantly secular in nature, we now need to explore how the movement is situated in society and politics. And whilst they are doing that, there are interesting notes in them. According to this classification, Hizmet constitutes an outward societal Islamic state, or something that when they of course social Islam, when they say this societal Islam or social Islam, I understand what they mean in reverse to political Islam, but the article thinks that just classifying as a societal Islam, however, does not answer whether it's best understood as a socially conservative or liberal form of social Islam. According to Agai, it is a communitarian and nationalistic movement. Hizmet is socially conservative with regard to the role of women, to whom it does not accord the leadership roles. Although there is a much recent approach changes in this topic, we can see in practice there isn't much change in the role of women within Hizmet movement. So Hizmet therefore refers to a sect whose outward-oriented activities are peaceful, but those work promotes a conservative understanding of family, state, nation, and especially a place for religion in modern society. So then I want to highlight something here. Like there is a discussion of Gulen exemplifies the form of a market Islam, an Islam that is opposed to statism, that promotes individualism and personal responsibility. Goal of this market Islam is to collective reform through the reform of individuals. I think that's a good point. Although Gulen accepts that people are not equal, that there is a need for hierarchy, he is, however, very clear that the poor and underprivileged cannot be blamed for their poverty. The existence of the poor, for Hizmet, is a chance for richer persons to show how they measure up. It's a point of responsibility. So transnational social space, this was very interesting for me because the article claims it's a transnational movement, or it is an emerging as a transnational movement, which is quite timely. Yes, I used to think that, but I also think that is not the main idea that was promoted from the beginning, but it is also the reality, especially after the coup attempt. The movement become more and more transnational. So the potential implications that are that research on Hizmet can no longer locate the movement only in its Turkish context. In 2013, you should look Hizmet in a wider context, or as a missionary movement from Turkish for a Turkish Islam. Okay. So it also talks about how it can become a competition between Saudi Iranian governmental Islam that Hizmet can provide an art. Then it talks about the community work, the networks. Hizmet have these 3 different transnational space for family, for business networks, and the community. The community or solidarity aspect is seen through the workings of the sect as well as in charity work. For example, Yadıgar, Hizmet charity in Germany, supports a school in Kyrgyzstan. That sort of stuff talks about it. And I think there's a couple more points. For instance, like in different places, how, for instance, in Albanian, I want to highlight this. I think, for instance, the Hizmet in various Central Asian republics appear to have different and not in a uniform way. For instance, it's similarly representatives in Hizmet locations draw different aspects of Gülen's teachings to localize their discourse. This is very Hizmet-like, yeah. The Albanian community, for example, built on the legacy of communism, and the crisis identified there was an emptiness of the country's spiritual life after communist dominance. a discourse that is irrelevant for Turkey. So you can see in Albania there are Hizmet, religious education is important, like through the Imam Hatip schools and stuff. By contrast, the German discourse, for instance, focused on the debt of Turkish Muslims to German society, and the movement is now repaying through education and dialogue activities. Within Turkey, the Ottoman heritage provides a source for authenticity that is promoted, while in Central Asia, Hizmet is also repaying a debt as Islam was brought to Turkey from the region, like from Fergana Valley and Central Asia anyway, and now the movement aids Central Asia reclaiming their Islamic heritage, or there was a notion of nationalism there as well. In Canada, for instance, the movement builds up upon the pluralism, multiculturalism, and interfaith dialogue aspect of Gulen work, much more than anywhere else, as this approach fits the Canadian context. In these initiatives merely hint a possibility that it might be advantageous to move away from sole focus on the Turkishness of the Hizmet movement and take its global engagement more seriously. Hizmet is following in the footsteps of other religious movements that have become post-national, that is, transnational actors, which was very clear anyway. They're creating a global Islamic space that might someday be independent from its origin. Of course, when the article is written, it wasn't intended to, no one was able to guess what would have happened and how the Turkish times would severely cut down the nationalism within the Hizmet movement will drastically go down because of the events that happen in Turkey, but it has already started transition from national to post-national or transnational. Whether this comes about is an open question, but research on Hizmet needs to take this possibility seriously so as to account for movements emerging global and local identity. I think for these reasons, I think it was an interesting article to read, and I just wanted to share with you. I like the fact that the way Sabine Dreher was able to actually have the difficulty of classifying Hizmet movement within the international political context, and how different people would approach Hizmet movement differently. And I think it is still relevant, and I think that they are the questions where Hizmet members have to think a little more and come up with more refined thoughts about them, because some of them are new issues. And I think the transnationalism is in the very much increased. Although when I have spoke about this transnationalism versus globalization, where I think Hizmet movement ideas were intended to be a bit global or local in a way, but it's stuck in the transnational Islamic movement, Turkish transnational Islamic movement identity far too long time. But it is of course an area where every day some changes are happening, but yet still the majority of the Hizmet members are very much attached to Turkey for various reasons. So it seems like in a different way Hizmet movement will stay a little longer as a transnational actor rather than a global actor, I think. But that's a different issue, and we can talk about it in a different time. Well, that's it. If you have any questions, I can probably take a couple of questions. It's just I thought it was a nice article to share, and that's also a good way to come back to all these videos that I used to do. I had to go away and harvest some support from doing by Turkish videos and stuff, which I have achieved quite a bit of sustainable projects. So I'll be doing more English videos, and if you stay around, subscribe, you will see more of content coming in the future. I'll be doing some specific topics, but I will be also following up and reading some articles and share interesting stuff that that comes by. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any questions, you can always write in the comment section. I'll be answering them, and want to extend my congratulations to Sabine Dreher. She's written more recent articles with a very different approach, but I didn't have a chance to go through that. Once I have read the recent article as well, maybe I'll do another video about that. And thank you very much. Have a nice day.